Does it just put like the...
Okay, I think we might be live. Are we live as far as you can tell? Okay. Well, welcome to my second ever live stream. I've got my 13-year-old daughter helping me as my producer. You might remember her from the flag thief video. She was the one who had the Canadian flag stolen. So just a few things I want to go over on this live stream. First, maybe first a quick update about the flag thief. So yesterday afternoon, evening, I'm trying to remember, I was on hold with the Ottawa Police Service for about a little over 25 minutes, went through their phone tree, just listened to a recording over and over. I guess they're experiencing unusually high call volume, so they say. I wanted to talk to an officer about that incident from, I guess it's about 11 days ago now. They did take my information and they did say they would call me. I have not heard from them. So I don't know if they lost my number or wrote something down wrong. So anyway, I left them. I ended up filling out a report online, just explaining the incident, reminding them that I've got video evidence that they might want to look at, and for them to please call me. I also, in that same report, I'll say reiterated or maybe was a little more forceful about my desire, insofar as it's up to me anyway, to have charges pressed against that fellow. So there's a quick update on that. I was just talking to my daughter a moment ago that we're pretty new to this, but we thought we might try it. She's going to monitor the comments. So if you had questions in there, put them in the chat and we'll see if we can get to them. I do have some comments that I want to react to that I think might be worth some discussion. But first, I just want to talk briefly about something that I think a lot of people might be surprised to hear. I certainly was when I came home from work and my wife texted me and said that Trudeau had basically ended the emergency measures, which I was not expecting. It's funny, the rhetoric in the news, Bill Blair especially, I think yesterday or the day before, there was an interview where he was alluding to these measures being in place for a lot longer, perhaps. And given the track record with the vaccine mandates and flattening the curve and all that type of thing, I think the general rule is when governments take more power, they tend to hold on to it. Something different's happened here. And I've got some ideas of maybe what happened. And this is basing this on some of my wife had to say. Again, I was at work today and in the wood shop, I'm not able to really check my phone that often. But it sounds like there was some interesting debate and comments in our Senate. And if you're like most Canadians or like me, you probably have no idea really what the Senate is or what it does. I don't really, other than it's meant to be the upper house or the sober second thought. In Canada, as best I know, senators are appointed, not elected. So I believe it's the Prime Minister's office at any given time that gets to fill vacancies. I could have that part wrong. And then once you're a senator, I believe you're a senator for life or until you turn 75. And, you know, you get a good pension and stuff like that. And mostly they rubber stamp what the House of Commons passes as part of our Westminster parliamentary system, or parliamentary, system, I suppose. So I don't know, but it seems as though maybe just the tone in the Senate today suggested that maybe this act was not going to pass the Senate, which would have been interesting to see just from a historical point of view, because I don't believe it's very often at all that the Canadian Senate actually would veto essentially something the House of Commons does. So I'm not sure if maybe Trudeau got worried that that would be the case and that would be embarrassing if it doesn't go through Parliament. I don't know about how the parliamentary system works exactly, if the Senate striking it down, if that would still be considered a confidence vote and if that might trigger an election. If you guys know, put that in the comments. It's one thing about this whole turn of events. It's forcing, well, me and my family, I'm sure others, to learn a little bit more about government and how it works. So anyway, that's surprising. I'm sure more will come out in the coming days. Perhaps it's the pressure from the international community. I think there's a lot of people that are, in my opinion, rightfully upset at Trudeau for invoking what are essentially war measures on a Canadian population. I wanted to take a few minutes to address some comments that I received. First of all, I want to say I've been really impressed with just the number of comments I've been getting and the quality of them. I don't know. I'm not really on any other social media platforms. I don't know what to compare it to, but for people who are on Twitter, I've heard it described as a dumpster fire, and I'm not sure if YouTube's maybe a little bit better, but the comments that I've been able to read have generally been very good. I try to get into the comments and answer them, but it's really dependent on time of day and when I have a few minutes to delve into them. So you might notice I answer a bunch and then I'm kind of silent for a while. So if you made a comment and I didn't answer it or respond to it, it's nothing against you necessarily. It's just might be a bad timing thing. And then after a while, things get buried. So there's a few comments I want to go over in a little bit of detail. And I selected these comments because, with one exception, they are comments that are critical of my position or critical of some of my arguments. And in my opinion, they've been put forward, as best I can tell, earnestly. Actually, in one case, I know it was meant in earnest because I happen to know the person. And I like seeing these comments for a few reasons. One, like all people, I've got my own blind spots. I've got my own biases. So just because I think something doesn't make it so. So this is a natural and humbling check against my own thinking. So having countervailing responses is a way for me to at least think through more carefully what it is I believe and why I believe it. Second is the fact that people are making these comments and they don't share my opinion on many of these things tells me that there are people watching my videos that disagree with me. And I think that's great. One concern I have about what's going on in the world and perhaps in our country or North America is that there is this increasing divide and we seem to be increasingly unable or unwilling to talk with one another. So for people to come to my channel, take the time to watch a video and then write a detailed comment explaining how I'm wrong or I've missed certain things or mischaracterized things. It says a lot. So I really do appreciate it. Anyway, I'm going to get in, and in no particular order, I'll get into some of these. So this one is, I think, this comment would have been my most recent video about, I guess, the police clearing away the protesters the other day. So this is from a fellow, or his handle or her handle is Puffy Clouds, and they write, "People create their own misery, then must enjoy wallowing in it. But it's okay because nothing is permanent, no matter how bad the situation is. It will certainly change. I don't think your interpretation of freedom being played out by the protest is compatible with the vast majority of Canadians' views. That said, I'll leave you with some rhetorical questions that I hope you read and ponder, as I know you like to ponder from time to time. I can see from your videos that you have strong opinions of how all Canadians should be processing what has transpired over the past few weeks. But do you really believe that the current democratically elected government should be dissolved and the prime minister removed without an election? Just quick aside, all these comments are at least a few days old prior to the ending of the Emergency Act. Are you really surprised that the citizens of Ottawa are upset about the manner in which the city that they live in is being treated? Do you think that Pat King is anything other than a racist that legitimately hates a portion of Canadians? Do you think that people will group your views with Pat King? Do you think that blocking off trade routes between Canada and the US is peaceful protest? I'll leave a favorite Chinese proverb of mine, which has served me well, and I hope it will reduce some of your anxiety regarding the protest. Quote, "He who blames others has a long way to go on his journey. He who blames himself is halfway there, and he who blames no one has arrived." And then he closes with, "Much love, brother." This is a great comment for so many reasons. I like it. Seems to be meant very sincerely. He starts saying, I'm assuming I'm going to use the male pronoun because I sort of assume it's a he. I like the sort of what I sense might be a little bit of Eastern philosophy at the beginning. People who create their own misery must enjoy wallowing it. And then at the end there. So I'll kind of go through this quickly here. So the first thing I think that's important is he's saying that he doesn't, as I understand it, and I should say, reading these comments, I'm doing my best to glean the tone and the punctuation and things. So I'm doing my best to interpret it, but with text, there's different ways one can interpret it. He's saying my interpretation of freedom that's being played out by the protest is not compatible with the vast majority of Canadians' views. I think what he's saying, I've heard this elsewhere, is that most Canadians are not aligned with the trucker protest. And that may or may not be true. On some level, it probably is true. So I'm not sure how that necessarily fits in with the argument. But I think and I'm maybe jumping ahead to another comment that I got, it seems that we think that because the vast majority, or the majority, a simple majority of Canadians don't agree with their message or even what they're doing, that that's necessarily wrong. And I don't think that that is sound logic necessarily, but I'll leave that there for now and continue here. I like the fact that he's, instead of making comments and sort of tacitly demanding an answer, the fact that he's given me permission to ponder these, I appreciate. I think I did respond to him saying something like, let me think about that and maybe get back to you. So he sees from my videos that I have strong opinions on how Canadians should be processing what has transpired. I think I know what he means. Yes, I do have strong opinions about what Canadians should be paying attention to here. I'm not saying that this is what he means, but in case what I don't mean is I don't think that all Canadians need to share my opinion. But I do have my own opinions as to the sorts of things that Canadians should be thinking about. Do you really believe that the current democratically elected government should be dissolved and the prime minister removed without an election? The short answer is no. It's interesting. I talked to a number of people in the crowds over the 3 weeks we were there. I generally ask people, like, why are you here in Ottawa? What message do you have for the prime minister? That kind of thing. I didn't go asking people explicitly, maybe with a few exceptions, as what they wanted done, other than the vaccine mandates ending. But in terms of the mechanics, I don't think many people shared. There was at least one person who had it in their head that if enough people lobbied the governor general, that maybe she might dissolve parliament. But I don't think people were there trying to like overthrow the government or do things that were outside of the law or outside of our constitution. One thing that I've noticed about this convoy, and you've seen my videos, for those of you who have seen my videos, I've interviewed a number of people. Many of the people in the crowd are very articulate, have well-reasoned thoughts, and can express themselves well, but not everyone can. So I think there's a lot of people, I can't remember if I mentioned this in another video, but you would maybe see signs saying like Trudeau belongs in jail. And you'd ask the people about that, and they couldn't necessarily articulate like what law he broke. And I think what might be happening in some cases is people have this visceral reaction that something is going wrong with their government. And in some cases, they might not have the skill to express it as articulately. So it comes out as, Trudeau's a crook, he should be locked up. Those were sort of the exceptions. I don't think people were really thinking that Trudeau would be put in prison. Now, in terms of the way our Constitution works, as I understand it, had the emergency measures not passed the House of Commons, that likely would have been interpreted as a confidence vote. And in Canadian parliamentary tradition, as best I understand it, a vote of non-confidence would likely, although there might be exceptions, would likely be cause for the Governor General to dissolve Parliament and trigger a new election. So anyway, just to answer the question, I would be in favor of legal and traditional and constitutional means to replace this government. I am not in favor of using any violence or any extra lawful or extrajudicial measures to beat that end. Are you really surprised that the citizens of Ottawa are upset about the manner in which the city they live in is being treated? Am I really surprised? Does some yes and no. So I understand, or I can certainly appreciate how having a large group of people in one city for a prolonged period of time can make it difficult just to sort of enjoy peace and quiet. It's worth noting that in my experience, from what I saw on the street firsthand, were a number of people who said they were from Ottawa. I sort of take them at their word. I didn't check their ID. So I think there are a lot of people from Ottawa that were supporting the protests. Now, whether or not I'm surprised by how people in Ottawa react is, I'm not sure how that fits in with sort of a larger argument as to whether or not these protests are peaceful or justified or lawful or unlawful. But yeah, I'm a little, and again, I'm using my own lens here. I mean, if I lived in Ottawa, I wouldn't have to drive the 5 hours to get there to wave my flag. So I would appreciate living in Ottawa because it'd be a short walk, but maybe the honking would upset me as well. Anyway, do you think that Pat King is anything other than a racist that legitimately hates a portion of Canadians? So I know I've heard the name. I saw on the news 2 days ago that he was arrested and I think released on bail. I know there was Tamara Leach, I think is her name, that didn't get bail. So I've seen some of these names. I've not watched any of Pat King's videos. I'm not really clear who he is, other than he's maybe I'm not sure if he's part of the official leadership. I don't know if there really is an official leadership of this. I mean, there's lots of Facebook groups and people online, but I certainly went there on my own volition, not because Pat King or anyone else asked me to go. I don't know whether he's a racist or not. I'm being maybe a little pedantic with your question here, Puffy Clouds. But even if he was a racist, I do believe he would be something other than a racist as well, because he's almost certainly a son and a neighbor, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know if that's what you mean. I don't know what you mean by that legitimately hates a portion of Canadians. Oh, maybe the legit, like that he clearly hates a portion of Canadians. It's possible. I mean, probably a lot of us in our less glorious moments hate people from time to time, and some of them might even have Canadian citizenship. Do you think that people will group your views with Pat King? On some level, yes, and we're already seeing that from the Prime Minister's office, from our mainstream media. Do I think that it's a legitimate guilt by association? Absolutely not. I mean, I felt like we've learned this with things like race and religion like decades ago, where just because one person of an identifiable group does one thing that you might find reprehensible, to take that particular behavior and then assume that everyone else who has that same characteristic, whether it be race or religion or country of origin, and apply that to everyone in that category. I mean, that used to be the definition of racism up until recently. And I don't think that's a fair way to judge someone. I'm with Martin Luther King that people should be judged by the content of their character, not by necessarily the company they keep or the color of their skin or how and if they worship their God, etc. Do you believe that blocking off trade routes between Canada and the US is peaceful protest? I'm going to be a little bit of a politician and not quite answer the question you asked, but answer a slightly different one. Do I believe that blocking trade routes is a legitimate form of protest? No. Is it peaceful? It can be, but is it legitimate under what our Constitution allows? I would say that's illegitimate. And the reason for that is under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, every Canadian is afforded a freedom of movement to move within Canada. And that's been violated through this pandemic, it's worth mentioning. You should be able to move freely throughout the country to go to any city or province you choose to go to, and also to leave Canada and to re-enter it if you're a Canadian citizen. So yeah, stopping other people from leaving Canada, I think, goes beyond what a reasonable protest would be, irrespective of whether it's peaceful. And then the favorite Chinese proverb, great way to end the comment. I like that. He who blames others has a long way to go on his journey. He who blames himself is halfway there, and he who blames no one has arrived. My own tradition, it sort of reminds me of something that Jesus said in the Gospels. I think in the Gospel of Matthew, he tells his followers not to be so concerned about the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye when you have a plank of wood in your own eye. I think there's maybe some parallels there, that I do agree that we should be, blame is a tricky word. I don't know if we're blaming people, but I think we should spend probably more energy trying to make ourselves better than trying to convince other people to be better. However, I think there is a time and place to call people to try to be the best versions of themselves that they can be. Anyway, I'll leave that there. Might be going long. Anyway, thanks for the comment, Puffy Clouds. Well written. Thank you for letting me ponder those. And please keep watching if you're willing, and keep making the comments. Next one. This one's shorter. And this is by Habib Osman. And he writes, now, I think he was writing quite a bit and we were responding. So a little bit of the context might be lost here, but I think you'll get the gist here. He writes, also, the Emergency Act invocation has nothing to do with the truckers' views. It has everything to do with the amount of disruption they are causing to infrastructure and trade. Livelihoods were being destroyed by them. They were abusing their rights to destroy others' lives. That is not just protest. That is occupation or even terrorism. It falls well within the authority of the police, mayor, and judge to stop such action. So it's interesting. Our Deputy Prime Minister, Chrystia Freeland, in that news conference where they announced the Emergencies Act being invoked, she spent quite a bit of time talking about the economic damage that these protests, according to her, were causing. And that may or may not be true. Actually, it probably is true, frankly. If you're blocking trade routes, it almost certainly, and if you're not trucking and you're parked in Ottawa, that is having an effect. But she said it as though that were a reasonable criterion by which to invoke the Emergencies Act. I'd say it's beside the point. Whether or not they're causing economic hardship does not affect the legitimacy or illegitimacy of their protest. They were abusing their rights to destroy others' lives. I'm going to come back to that one because in the next comment we talk about that. I'm not sure if this is meant to be hyperbole. Occupation, I mean, I disagree that an occupation, just looking up sort of the dictionary definition, I know there's many definitions for words, and just going to the dictionary isn't always the best way to do it. But to me, it connotes the idea of a foreign power or an illegitimate power unjustly occupying or existing in a certain space. I don't think it's the right way to characterize citizens going to a city in their own country, their capital city at that. I don't know that occupation is the right word for that. And terrorism, I think that's beyond the pale. You'd have to ask what was done exactly that would constitute terrorism. That's words do matter, and unfortunately, there are real terrorists, and there are real racists, and there are real extremists out there. And when we start using those words for people and events that are clearly, in my opinion anyway, clearly fall well below that threshold, it cheapens the currency of those words. Anyway, I'll leave that there. But thanks, Habib. That was just sort of one sample. He left many other comments. And again, I think he generally asked fair questions and was offered in a spirit of conversation, etc. Casey, anything from the comments that I should address now, or?
There's a couple from the beginning.
Okay.
Was the Senate going to vote down the Emergencies Act?
Yeah, so the question is, was the Senate going to vote down the Emergency Act? That's anyone's guess. I was talking to my wife today. I'm not sure if such a parliamentary mechanism exists. I'd be surprised if it did, but it would be interesting if the House of Commons. Well, what I do know is as soon as Trudeau ended the Emergency Act, I believe the Senate stopped deliberating, so it became moot. It would be interesting. I think it's unlikely. I'm not sure if there's a mechanism where the House of Commons could ask the Senate to offer some sort of opinion on the legality of, well, I shouldn't say the legality. That's not quite fair, although I do have questions about the legality of it, about which way they would go. I doubt they would. I doubt such mechanism exists. And even if it did, my sense is the Senate would be reluctant to answer what's now a hypothetical question. Anything else worth mentioning?
Another one is, why do you think Trudeau invoked the Emergency Act, and why did he end it at the last second?
Yeah. So the question is, why do I think Trudeau? I'm just repeating these because I'm not sure how much of the audio is coming through. Why do I think Trudeau invoked the Emergency Act, and why do I think he ended it so abruptly? Frankly, I think our Prime Minister has misunderstood the difference between a national emergency and a political emergency. He certainly has a political emergency. He underestimated the trucker convoy. He hasn't spoken to them, as far as I know. He hasn't acted in good faith. He has maligned the character of the participants and that class of people that they represent. And I think it's blown up in his face. So that definitely is a political emergency. Unfortunately for our Prime Minister, a political emergency does not constitute a national emergency. Why did he end it so abruptly? That's a good question. I'm sure there's lots of speculation. The Senate, the fact that he ended it while the Senate was deliberating suggests some probability, I can't know for sure, of course, that he felt that maybe the Senate was not going to pass it, and that would be embarrassing and maybe even defeat his government. I don't know if that's mechanically how that would work. Yeah, those are my thoughts. Anyway, I'll let you have a look. I'm going to jump into this last one and get into this. Oops. Okay, this is from someone I know quite well personally. So I know it was offered sincerely and in good faith. It's from Bob Fraser, and he writes, Peter, I 100% disagree with the invoking of this act and the dangerous overreach by the government, which is great, but, and then he goes on, while a high percentage of Canadians empathize and support the message of the demonstrators in Ottawa, an overwhelming percentage of Canadians also believe that message was heard early on in the protest, and these folks should have gone home long ago. I know that you disagree. However, the freedoms of those occupying Ottawa do not give them the right to trounce on the freedoms of the citizens of Ottawa. What originally began as a peaceful protest turned into an ugly occupation of a city. So, you have asked people from both sides to consider whether the government should have enacted this legislation. I have declared my opinion above supporting yours. Now I ask you for you to consider the overwhelming opinion of Canadians that believe in the cause, but also believe that the demonstrators need to leave Ottawa now. Knowing that further occupation of Ottawa will not further the cause, how would you see the siege of Ottawa end peacefully without the use of force? Okay, great question. And I know Bob personally, and he's written several comments in various videos, and they're all, he goes into some detail, which I appreciate. So like some of these other comments, what I think is being implied here is because most Canadians, arguably, don't, and most, I want to say Ottawans, is that the right term? Most people in Ottawa don't support it. I'm just going to grant that for the sake of this discussion. Then, therefore, the rights of the majority of Canadians would trump, if you forgive the term, would take precedent over the rights of the protesters. Well, viscerally, that feels like it makes sense. We live in a democracy. We believe that the majority of the people should rule the day. And that is generally true, but it's not absolutely true. And part of our tradition here in the West, and certainly here in Canada, goes back to the British tradition of property rights and human rights, like back to like the time of Magna Carta, which is like 800 years ago or so. Now, when Magna Carta was enacted or written, it wasn't so much all people, but it was the nobles, and they wanted to have their rights recognized from the monarchy. Because I guess prior to Magna Carta, perhaps the monarchy would basically rule by fiat. The king decided that your house was his, then it became his house just by him saying so, or something to that effect anyway. So they wanted protection against absolute power from one person. And so Magna Carta sort of outlined sort of or limited the power of government, which in those days was the monarchy, to prevent tyranny, prevent the government from tyrannizing the people, or at least the nobles in those days. And that tradition started something that eventually trickled down to each and every person. So this idea that governments can be tyrannical, governments can take too much power, and that the people that they govern need protections over those powers. So in Canada, it's true, we are a democracy, so we have general elections, but we can still be tyrannized. So the way like our democracy works is when there's an election, we get to decide by general election, more or less, who gets to form the government. But once we have a government formed, that does not, just because they're like maybe like 100% of people, let's say, voted for Justin Trudeau, like every seat in Parliament was a Liberal seat, like we all love Trudeau, we all voted for him. He still does not get to decide that one day he gets my house or my car, or that he can throw someone in jail. That's not the way it works. And the reason that's important is the majority can also be a tyrant. Think, for example, like you live in a town, and if all the townspeople decide, you know what, you're a real scoundrel, the local constable should just put you in jail just because we don't like you, and you should just have to deal with it. And the town has a referendum, and everyone votes, like it's all the townspeople except for you vote in favor of you being locked up. Should you be locked up? And the answer that we've come to in the West is no, that individuals, despite the majority being on the other side, still have fundamental rights. And among those rights are due process, protection from illegal search and seizure. Like the government can't just decide that something that's yours is theirs, despite what our deputy prime minister would have us believe. The right to speak what is on our mind, freedom of expression, freedom of peaceful assembly. So that gets to my point here is, and again, I'm not trying to be glib about this, but on some technical level, yes, the exercising of one's charter rights do get to trounce, to use Bob's word, the rights of the citizens of Ottawa to have a quiet evening or to have clear streets. That might sound a little bit harsh, but these are fundamental rights that we have. Now, the thing that I think a lot of people have trouble with is they think, well, if we have these rights to protest, then any old group at any old time will get together and cause trouble and make noise. What's interesting about protests, though, is there's some baked-in costs to those things, especially in the wintertime. It's cold. It means you have to do something other than work or watch, Netflix or whatever else. So you have to be pretty compelled to go out and wave a flag or bring your placard to City Hall, etc. So there's a built-in cost to that, which tends to filter out, unreasonable sort of, or frivolous, I should say, not unreasonable protests, because that's sort of the point. You have the right to put a placard and ask for any old ridiculous. If you want your province to separate, if you think the aliens are coming and we need to spend money on anti-alien defenses, whatever kooky or good idea you have, that's sort of not the point. You have the right to peacefully protest. Now, as soon as you start putting bricks through windows or lighting cars on fire, et cetera, then that ends. What is maybe more of a gray zone is things like parking trucks illegally. That's not a criminal offense. That's a bylaw, and there are laws on the books. And that is something that is to take it to an extreme level, I mean, the police could have removed, like legally, could have removed trucks from the downtown core of Ottawa. I don't know that they have the right. In fact, as I read the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, they do not have the right to remove the person carrying their Quebec flag and waving their placard. That anyway, and part of this business about protest is sometimes we think we have these rights because we think protests are a good end unto themselves, that's what we're trying to achieve. But really, it's not that the protests are necessarily good, it's that they are better than the alternative. If people can't, like, I mean, it wasn't that long ago. If you look at human history, if you're upset with your government, you grab pitchforks and muskets and spears and you amass a group and you depose your king or your feudal lord or what have you. And that is like literally a bloody mess. That's not how we want to live. So it's not that we think protests are good in and of themselves. They're better than the alternative. And that is violence in the street. And none of us want that. So we put up with some disruption, some noise, some inconvenience, because we know that the alternative of having strong political dissent or political grievances that are unheard, we need a mechanism, we need an outlet for the people to express themselves. And it's hard for people to do it peacefully. I'll admit that. Like, it's actually a miracle that this protest, and from what I've seen firsthand, what I've seen on camera, has been so peaceful and did not get out of hand, did not turn into a riot, even as the police were using force. So it might sound extreme, but it's important to a society that we have these rights protected. It's important that we can express ourselves freely, because the alternative is not just, I guess the alternative is you can just shut up and be quiet and accept tyranny, or it's fighting in the streets. And I don't want either of those. Anyway, there's a couple other things in here. What's being suggested, the overwhelm. That's probably the main point. And then he writes, knowing that further occupation of Ottawa will not further the cause. I mean, that's conjecture. I mean, we don't know, because the police did clear it out since he wrote this. But someone who's not there arguing that you've made your point and you should go home is sort of beside the point. Whether it's furthering the cause or not, the person has the right. There is no time limit, as far as I know. If you want to hold a flag at City Hall or a placard in a public square, you want to do that 12 months of the year. And there are people that do it. Anyway, I'll leave that there. How are we on time? Boy, this is going longer than I thought. Any other questions worth touching on?
We have another one that I highlighted earlier. Just
Okay.
give me a second.
Sure. I'm not sure if I'll get into this now, but Andrea, and this is sort of in a totally different direction, but Andrea B. wrote something about 2 weeks ago, and this was for one of my conspiracy theory videos, I think, which I think are my least viewed videos, for what that's worth. But she writes, and I've been meaning to talk about this or to answer her. She writes, you mentioned animated spirits. I think it was animating spirits, but then she says, please elaborate on your thinking of the concept. I've thought about you mentioning this several times. So I'm not sure if she means I've mentioned it in more than one video. Maybe I'll talk about it. And this is, this doesn't have to do with politics so much. This has more to do with theology, and theology, for most people, probably aren't into theology, but it's very hard to keep this contained. So I'll try to keep it contained. There's different ways we could look at that. So just from the word, to animate is to give life to something. And I'm going to look at this through a bit of a spiritual lens, but you can look at it through a psychological lens. That spirit is the motivating or animating, the driving force behind, I guess, one's actions. And that could be figurative. You could think of it like some more fundamentalist religious people would think of that as very literal. Other people may be more metaphorical. A good analogy, actually, it's interesting that in the Bible, the words that are translated to spirit. In Hebrew, it's ruha, and in Greek, it's pneumas, where we get pneumatics. It means air. So it can mean air, breath, wind. So if you think of a sailboat going across a lake, the animating spirit, what is the spirit? What is the wind that gives it life? I was talking about the literal wind. So I can't remember the exact context I was using for that, but I think that, and you could look at it more psychologically, like our disposition. What is our disposition that is driving us to do or say or act in different ways? And it's interesting when I think, and again, I'm looking at this through, I guess, more of a Christian lens, but, in the letter to the Galatians, the Apostle Paul talks about the fruit of the Spirit, and the idea being, if you are aligned, or maybe not aligned, if you're resonating with God, if you're sort of tuned in with Him, in general, you will see what he calls the fruit of the Spirit, or the outcome of the Spirit. And a few of them are love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, goodness, and self-control. I won't look it up, but you get the gist. The idea that when you're resonating with God, those are the sorts of things you will see. And it's worth mentioning that at the trucker convoy, whether people knew they were resonating with God or not, or whether they would use those words to describe it, I saw a lot of those aforementioned things on the streets of Ottawa. What's interesting is when I was talking to the counter protesters, I kind of saw the opposite. I saw a lot of anger and bitterness and pettiness. Like, you can kind of, if you've seen those videos, you can even, it's not just the words they say, but it's how they say them. That I would say that there is an animating spirit, like whatever is driving them seems to be more like frustration, bitterness, anger, contempt, those sorts of emotions. Anyway, great question, Andrea. I've been meaning to I tried answering that in the comments, and I would start writing, and I'd go off in all kinds of directions. Do you have maybe we'll do...
How's the heavy police presence working for Ottawa business owners?
How is the heavy police presence working for Ottawa residents and business people? Yeah, I'm not sure if I have it here. I don't know. It doesn't matter. Oh, there it is. All right. I'm reminded of George Orwell's 1984. Another book he has, it's called Animal Farm. It's also in this volume. And it's basically an allegory of the Russian Revolution. And the gist is the animals on this animal farm get rid of their oppressive farmers that are humans, and then very quickly replace them with even more repressive, this time they're animals. So they're still in the same situation. They just have slightly different masters. I think that's what's happened. Like, yeah, the streets of Ottawa were blocked with trucks and people making free pizza and giving out hugs and playing hockey on Wellington Street and setting up bouncy castles. And, in fairness, if you worked on Wellington Street, you'd have to move through that crowd. Now we've got rid of all those terrible truckers, and we've put up fences, and now we have police checkpoints. And still, as far as I know, I'm not sure if they started taking the fences down now that they've ended the Emergencies Act. Now the city of Ottawa have gotten rid of their truckers, and now they've got essentially a police state. So I'm not sure how that's working for them. What I do know is most businesses that we saw were closed. It was funny. I mean, just to be a little difficult, I guess, my wife and I tried going to a sit-down restaurant that we knew we'd be turned away from because we don't have a vax pass that we'd be willing to share. And the restaurant was empty, save for like maybe 3 people. And they had a security guard there. And I'm not sure if it was literally next door, but like 2 doors down, there was a pizza, and it was just hopping. And people were lining up, and they were doing great business. So I think and we saw that with some Tim Hortons that were open. They had lineups out there. Sorry if I'm repeating myself for other videos. I can never remember what makes it into my videos and what I still have as raw footage. But we heard reports from people in line at the Tim Hortons that they were so overrun with customers that the truckers themselves started mopping the bathrooms and taking out the garbage and just helping the franchisees with the extra foot traffic, there's a lot of slush, so they're mopping the floors and stuff like that. So the ones that are open did well. The ones that were closed, not so much. There's one sign we saw, it said, "Sorry, we're closed." My wife and I both looked at that, and we had the same thought come to our mind, and she beat me to the punch. But basically, the sign might as well have said, "Sorry, we're scared." Anyway, good question. Maybe should we do one more and then wrap things up? Wow, 45 minutes.
How are the police at Ottawa going to pay for all the assaults they committed as well as the laws they broke?
Yeah, how are the police going to pay for the assaults they committed and the laws they broke? Yeah, good question. I still have some faith in our judiciary, maybe. This will be long and drawn out, but there will be, I think there's already some investigations. The SIU, which is the Special Investigations Unit, I believe, that investigates police violence and things like that. So yeah, that will probably take, I think there was the I can't remember what the number, G7, G6, G8, some event in Toronto in 2010. I remember being there, not to protest, but I was working in the area in those days. And the police acted pretty reprehensibly. Interestingly enough, the Toronto police chief in those days was someone named Bill Blair, who happens to be our Minister of Emergency Readiness or something to that. Like, he's our emergencies minister. Anyway, but that took like literally years to sort out. Like, they did investigations, and there was a commission and a whole thing, and actually came across the report online just yesterday. Anything else pressing there? I did say one more, and then maybe one more. This will be the last one, I promise. If there is one more.
Did you speak about Slowly's resignation yet?
I have.
Was very good.
Well, thank you. Yeah. So did I talk about Peter Slowly's resignation yet? And that my message to him was very good. Well, thank you for that comment. I haven't talked about it on this live stream. So for those of you who don't know, Ottawa has gone through a couple of police chiefs. There's one even in between that if you blinked, you would miss it. So we had Peter Slowly, who's been there for roughly 2 years, I understand. He resigned, and then the Police Services Board basically hired someone from Waterloo who was literally in place for 2 days, I believe. And then they overturned that or something. Or he resigned. Sorry, yeah, he resigned. And the gist of it was he felt there was too much, that council wasn't behaving well, or wasn't unified or of one mind, something to that effect. You can look it up. And then we had Steve Bell, who was a deputy chief and I guess temporarily promoted to interim chief. So yeah, Slowly's resignation. It'll be interesting. I can only guess. He's been pretty quiet about it as far as I can tell. It sounds like there's some article that suggested that there was some negotiated settlement. So I'm assuming he got a bunch of money, and I can only assume that was in exchange for him, at least in part, to stay quiet about why he resigned. So perhaps, I mean, these are all plausible explanations. One could be that the city felt that he wasn't cracking down on the protesters hard enough, and they got tired of him, and they said, listen, you got to resign. And they framed it as a resignation. Another possibility, which is also plausible, is actually there's a couple, that he was unwilling or unable to, understandably have his officers break up what is by and large a lawful protest. I sense that maybe people in the ranks weren't going to follow him. Who knows how much money he got? But boy, like he could have been like a Canadian hero. Like, could you imagine had he gone to like a podium and went in front of mainstream media and said, I'm getting political pressure to violate the constitutional rights of these people. As long as I'm chief, I will not do it. And if you have a problem with that, you can fire me. And then they fire him. Like, I would be first in line to say, like, let's put a statue of Peter Slowly up in Ottawa, and he will be So anyway, I don't know how much money he got. This is all conjecture, but I don't know that. I am going to leave it there. Thank you guys for taking the time to watch. Boy, 50 minutes. I didn't think it would go this long. If this is the type of thing you guys like, and I guess you're tuning in, so maybe you do, maybe we can do this on a bit more of a regular basis if I can convince my intrepid producer to help me. She's been great. You guys have a good night, and I'll check in with you again soon. Thanks for watching. I really do appreciate it.